everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have a special guest, Mendel Kaelen, founder, CEO of Wavepaths. Really fun conversation. Just wrapped a few minutes ago with him, and just really happy to bring this to you. It's a really needed conversation. We talk about music and psychedelics a lot, and Wavepaths is possibly the future of psychedelics and music. Well, time will tell, but it looks that way. Mendel's probably done more academic work on the topic than anybody I know. And this intersection of psychedelics and music is endlessly interesting. Like, if we didn't have music paired in with psychedelics for so many decades, it might seem alien, but it is a kind of a native thing. And yeah, the 60s proved it. We're proving it now, the way Burning Man and raves look. And, what psychedelic study hasn't had music in it, at least in the last 10 years. It's pretty interesting. So food for thought. And I hope you like it. This is a really fun one for me. I've been hoping to get Mendel on the show for a long time. And if you want to learn more, check out Wavepaths. The app should be just about available as this comes out. So a consumer version and a therapist version. So check it all out. Stay tuned. Get on their email list, and it's very much worth staying in tune on this. And I'm hoping over the next few months to learn how to use the software. So yeah, I think you'll enjoy this one. So have fun, and we'll see you on the other side. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have a very special guest. I've been trying to get him on the show for ages. Mendel Kaelen, founder and CEO of Wavepaths. How you doing, Mendel?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just really happy we were finally able to make it happen. This has been a long time coming, and I'm just as excited now as I was when I first started hearing about you and Wavepaths.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think we were in touch like 2 years ago or something at first.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's been years. And I've been very excited about what you've been up to, and I can't wait to learn more. So, Mendel, to dig in.
Patience.
Yeah, when you do enough holotropic breath work, you become really patient. Most of the time. So, I want to kind of start off with just kind of giving a little bit of a sketch about who you are and how you got into this kind of interesting intersection of psychedelics and music.
Sure.
Like, where do you like to start this story?
Well, wherever you want, there's different ways to unpack this story.
Well, maybe let's start with where did music become really important to you? Because I assume music started before psychedelics started.
Very true, very true. In fact, at some point, I started to correct myself, because I always used to say that psychedelic mushrooms were my first introduction into altered states of consciousness. But then at some point I realized that music actually was my very first introduction in altered states of consciousness. I grew up in a musical family, and I'm originally trained in classical guitar, but I also started to experiment with lots of different things. I drummed in a metal band when I was 17 years old. Very gradually moved more into experimental music, and discovering new musical experiences was, and still is, a huge thing in my life. And when I reflect back on my teenage years, I see someone that would sometimes lock himself up for many hours in his bedroom with a headphone, and I would often turn the lights off and go deep inside with music. And when I reflect back on that, especially given the music that I was listening to, there was a great sense of healing that happened in those experiences. It was very clear that the music was giving me a degree of acknowledgement, a degree of understanding, a degree of connection that I couldn't find at that moment in my life around me. And that's one reason why I really started to see, also through my own personal experience, that music can be this source for connection and acknowledgement and empathy. And there is, in fact, research that backs it up as well. I don't want to get into the research immediately, but people who are scoring high on empathy usually tend to respond much more strongly to music as well, which is quite an interesting finding.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah,
And
music
mm,
was huge for all of my life. In fact, I quitted university for a year after my bachelor's and my master's, and after my bachelor's and before my master's, to think about this question: whether I want to pursue a career in sound art, or whether I want to pursue a career in psychedelic science or psychedelic therapy research more specifically. And eventually, I decided to choose the latter, not realizing that in fact these two big interests could be harmonized. That came much later while I was working at Imperial College London.
mm. Well, that's excellent, and it's perfect. You found this bridge to make the two happen, and
Hmm.
it's an interesting. Maybe it's a platitude that you can. It's really hard to become the expert in one thing, but not so hard to become the expert in two things, like where those two things meet. A
Hmm.
little easier, a little easier. I'm not going to
Yeah,
say it's simple, but
I agree with that to a certain degree, but I'm in this funny situation where there is no one else who's focusing purely on understanding the role of music in psychedelic therapy. Thankfully, there are some researchers and some colleagues that are picking this up. But with that respect, I've been exploring and entering this white space, this unexplored terrain
yeah,
in modern science, at least. There were some researchers that did some really important work in the 60s.
yeah. So I was actually describing you to my girlfriend earlier, and I was like, I think I would call him the world's foremost expert in music for psychedelic sessions. And I was like, I don't know if he'll claim that, but I don't know anybody else that's really an expert. Like when I see people talk about music and psychedelics, it's typically non-musicians with
Right,
minimal training,
right,
like that
right.
may not understand music theory whatsoever.
Right, yeah, right. Or
I find that problematic.
the complexities of the psychology of the musical experience as well, which is huge and in itself relatively poorly understood. It's a whole field of research in itself if you even take away the psychedelic component.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking recently that musicians, good musicians that can captivate people on stage are essentially psychologists. They have like a great understanding of the psyche and they
Hmm.
can really work people.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and a great intuition as well, how to create those sounds that move people.
Right, absolutely. So it's a really interesting skill set and I think undervalued. And I really just can't wait, Mendel, for you for you to have a bunch of students working under you, trying to learn from you and developing this field further. Like do
It's
you
happening, yeah,
are
it's happening already.
perfect. Are there others who are like, so as far as you understand, there's no other people doing real current scientific research on this topic?
Well, that's not fully true. So there's a few colleagues in the field, Catherine Preller and Frederick Barrett, most notably,
Hmm.
that I collaborated with as well, that have been doing, and I know that Fred is still doing some work on music and psychedelics, but relatively few. But given the position that we are in, we get a lot of inbound interest of clinical trials around the world working with psychedelics that are seeking support, seeking advice on how to work best with music. And we are supporting these trials at the moment. We are actually, in fact, working with more than 10 clinical trials, ranging from Australia, different parts of Europe, Canada, the US, where we are supporting therapists in the person centered use of music in psychedelic therapy.
Hmm.
And in return, we get some research data, and we are committed to publish that research data in good open source academic journals to really help further the understanding of such a complex but hugely important topic.
Mm. Well, it's good to know. I'm
Mm.
happy to hear that. So I want to kind of go back to your origin story a little bit more. So we talked about how transformative and impactful music was for you. I'm curious about, the impact of that mushroom experience you mentioned. Like, was that kind of shattering to your conception of the world or what was going on there?
Yeah, hugely impactful. Hugely impactful. People afterwards ask me what happened to me. People really notice the change in
Mm,
my character, my way of being, and I wasn't necessarily seeking the psychedelic experience with mushrooms for that reason. I wasn't seeking it to change myself. I got curious. I got curious after I read stories about ketamine being able to facilitate out of body experiences. I already switched my studies away from marine biology, focusing on neuroscience because of this growing interest in understanding consciousness. And then further reading about ayahuasca and San Pedro and all these psychedelic plant medicines that have such an incredibly rich history. And that was simply put one of those aha moments where it's so logical that many of these religious traditions have these shamanic roots, and these shamanic methods are often grounded in the use of these plants and the use of music. So there was that curiosity around the experience itself that made me eventually take psychedelic mushrooms. And I read everything I could. I already had access to academic journals back then. This was in 2005, and it became very clear that these mushrooms are physically safe, but that the setting is very important. And I found, thankfully, some people that were guiding me into this experience. But in the experience, I was seeing how I was withholding myself. I was a block to myself in many opportunities in life, in many connections and friendships in life. And there was a switch that moved this way of perceiving the world and myself away from being quite a pessimist towards much more of an opportunistic optimist that sees opportunities. And in doing that, I got rid of a depression that I never got diagnosed with, but it was very clearly a depression that became more and more crippling over the years. Suddenly, I was able to experience hope, to be able to imagine a more hopeful and positive future. And this is really what's so typical for all these patients that are struggling with depression as well, is this inability to imagine a positive future. So it had a really powerful impact on myself personally at the very first. And then I started to understand that there was this whole field of organizations and researchers that were trying to do their best for years and decades in some cases to get this research back into the world. And it became clear that I wanted to do something with it. It wasn't really clear what it was, but I wanted to work and help make psychedelic therapy more accessible, understand it better, how it can be made available to care seekers. So it's my work is very much grounded in that personal experience for sure.
Yeah. And was that kind of just a random experience, or was it kind of intentional with a guide?
It was a funny one.
Yeah.
um, I once I said to a friend that I'm interested to experience a psychedelic. Back then, I wanted to try LSD at first. He mentioned that he knew friends he was still in touch with from high school that were doing, in their words, mushroom evenings from time to time, a few times a year. And basically, what they were doing is they had this whole house for themselves. They were brothers, and they would redesign the whole house and have unique designs and unique soundscapes for the different rooms in the house. And then they would take the mushrooms together with a group of friends. And usually there would be one or two people that would stay sober. And then all the others would freely explore the experience. And although it was on their end very much a recreational intention, the beautiful thing about this setup was that you could still find your space. You could navigate and find an environment that would be really suiting for you, where you could actually experience what you need to experience or want to experience.
Mm.
I'm still thinking back about that design as having some potential to actually explore in different contexts as well. This idea of having a multi-spaced venue with different rooms as a way to explore while in an influence of a psychedelic with therapeutic intention involved, maybe even. But there was not a trained guide involved. There was not a trained therapist involved, and none of us had a therapeutic intention for sure.
Great. Are you familiar with Meow Wolf?
Totally, yeah, absolutely.
It sounds kind of like Meow Wolf to me. I know a lot of people who have consumed LSD and mushrooms there, and it's just incredible how differently the rooms feel.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
was
yeah.
sober when I was there, and it was just mind blowing what environment and sound can do. I guess environment including sound, but and done more intentionally. Perhaps what would be nice if is if we could get an exemption to do some research at Meow Wolf for a couple days, just to
Yeah,
look at
yeah.
this, get an exception
And
from the feds.
I got introduced to one of the founders of Meow Wolf, Corvus, about a year ago, actually.
Mm,
Um, we became friends, and he became a supporter of Wavepaths, and we definitely explored the similarities between us in a really deep interest in using immersive arts and technology to create these unique experiences in a physical environment, in a real embodied physical environment. I think the main difference is that Meow Wolf is very much focused on the entertainment qualities of these environments. The
absolutely.
Whereas on our end, we are, needless to say, very interested in understanding how we can use these multisensory environments for the improvements of mental health and well-being. And this is what we've been doing in London as well. About 1.5 years ago, we had this pop-up experience, this pop-up space in London, where we did that. We not only focused on music, but we also focused on light and texture and smell and the interpersonal relationships and really every single thing that would have an influence on the experience of the visitor, and ask how we can design that experience as such that it can be a transformative experience, an experience in which the visitor can experience oneself from a new perspective, as such that it can lead to this change in one's life, in one's way of being afterwards.
Right. That's interesting. So it sounds like kind of your orientation is definitely like medical, right? So like understanding how we can do therapy better.
It's medical in a sense that I'm deeply interested in understanding mental health, how we define mental health, and how we can facilitate better options, better therapies for people. But it's not medical in the sense in the associations that may conjure up for many people, because I believe that that's exactly what's wrong with medicalizing mental health too much. Is this this idea that if you suffer, if you are depressed, if you suffer trauma, if you suffer from severe anxiety and so forth and so on, that you seek help, and this therapist or psychiatrist offers to you a solution. It offers to you a pill, something that you can passively perceive, passively take, and be expected that it will do something good to you. Whereas in reality, mental health is much more complex, and this is becoming really clear also from the research with psychedelics. It really invites this element of engagement, of co ownership or full ownership over the changes that you want to or need to facilitate in yourself, in your own perceptions, but also in your behaviors. And this is, I mean, this is a whole conversation in itself that I think we can explore. That's of interest. But the the medical model has a lot of flaws, and I think the great opportunity with psychedelic therapy is actually to challenge some of the foundations of this medicalized psychiatric approach to suffering.
I was talking to my teacher Lenny yesterday about just the term drugs and
Mm.
how new of a thing that is, and how like what we really mean by drug is something that does an immediate thing. Like I'm thinking of statins or antibiotics. They do a specific thing. And I'm
Mm.
not trying to give credit to homeopathy at all here, but homeopathy looks at how to work around an issue to it's a roundabout approach versus a direct approach. And psychedelics are kind of this roundabout approach in a lot of ways that seems to more match this homeopathic model than traditional medicine. So I think that's one of the big reasons why it looks so different and weird to the current medical establishment. But it's really hard to frame that and communicate that because, I never want to say homeopathy out loud because I've got major issues with it, but
Yeah, yeah.
other people love it. But just that concept of a roundabout approach, I think is the important thing to look at.
What exactly do you mean with a roundabout approach?
Oh, well, like the LSD or mushrooms, they're not like those molecules aren't directly addressing, like, say, for example, blood
Right.
pressure,
Right.
or like they're not going in and saying, oh, like we got to trim these proteins out or something, or like proton pump inhibitor. Like it doesn't work in that same way. It's more like doing global things and getting change as a result of doing those, massive things. It's just a really different way of applying drugs, I think.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's not our normal model of drugs. Like you don't take an aspirin to cure you take aspirin for a headache or ibuprofen or something, but not necessarily like LSD, because that's a different thing. Probably not a great example, but
I see what you mean. Yeah. So psychedelics have this interesting property to be so, but their experience to be so much determined by variables other than the drug, the
yes.
mindset, the environment, the expectations, and everything that's part of that environment. But I think psychedelics are interesting because needless to say, they're interesting, but they're- it's not all. It's not only the experience that matters. I don't think we should minimize the neuropharmacological effects too easy as well. There is this interesting synergy that happens between them. There are these interesting effects on neuroplasticity and the interesting effects on mental flexibility that seem to be prolonged for periods after that the drug is already out of the system. That together with the experience create this opportunity for change. But you're completely right that the drug and the therapeutic potential should be judged based on the way it's being administered and the way that the therapy is being performed. But this I can't cite the right paper out of my head here, but there are some papers out there, some research papers that show some very similar things for other drugs, some context dependent variables that modulate the experience for alcohol and for amphetamines and for antidepressants, needless to say. And I think this is what's known as well in psychiatry, that placebo effects are huge. And rather than trying to get rid of the placebo effect, I think this is actually an invitation to understand the power of the mind, if you wish, a bit better. And there's plenty of research that shows, for example, if you combine antidepressants with a psychotherapeutic modality, that the effects and the duration of these effects are much longer after termination than if you would just give these antidepressants. Really, again, giving evidence, giving voice to this idea that there's something about the pathology, and needless to say, in these mental health disorders that really need to be taken seriously and can't be brushed aside by a pure biological um, set of variables such as genetics or serotonin or you name it, which is a terrible leftover from the Prozac generation, everything that followed. It was um, good to good, too good to be true in a way, and it was fitting this whole marketing campaign of antidepressants really well, the simplicity of it. But it failed terribly. The efficacy of antidepressants is still the same as electroconvulsive shock therapy, which is was invented like 6 decades ago.
Right. That's a great comparison. I appreciate that. Yeah. Like we should keep that in mind. Yeah. So I guess before I could easily go right off the rails here into many tangents, but I kind of want to keep it on music for a little bit
Sure,
longer.
sure.
So was part of your PhD work at Imperial around studying music with people and psychedelics?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's where it began. So one in the first year of my PhD, actually, I became more aware of the centrality of music,
Mm.
and and I made this argument that in order to understand what's happening in psychedelic therapy, we shouldn't just study the drug in isolation. We should look at the context, and music is maybe one of the most prominent context variables present, especially when you listen to music with an eye mask and with headphones. It's almost the only stimulus that you're exposed to. Uh, and that's really where my research career took off, is focusing on understanding the neuroscience of music and psychedelics, and afterwards the experience of music while under the influence of psychedelics and how that relates to positive therapy outcomes. The large majority of that work is part of my PhD, then a 1-year postdoc at Imperial as well, and then a continuation of a lot of these questions under Wavepaths up until the present moment.
Well, let's talk about Wavepaths. One
Sure.
of the most important, well, one of the things that really caught my attention in the early days was the announcement that you had some sort of partnership with Brian Eno.
Mm.
And that just blew my mind. I was like, wait, what? All right. And for those who don't know, legendary musician, part of Talking Heads and probably many other projects. But yeah, let's kind of start talking about how do you like to describe Wavepaths at this point?
Yeah, and it's great you mentioned Brian, and there's others involved as well of similar caliber, I would argue. Tom Hopkins and Robert Rich and Greg Haynes and many more to come that we are currently speaking with. Yeah, so the reason why we work with these artists is really closely linked with what I believe is one of the most important insights of psychedelic therapy research. And that is that when you look at the predictive variables for positive therapy outcomes, they are not related to the intensity of the drug effect itself, but out of the wide range of different experiences that people can have with these compounds, there are certain experiences that are related to positive therapy outcomes. And when you look at what these experiences are, they are experiences like peak experiences or experiences like deep autobiographical insight and emotional release. They're all experiences that have to do with meaning. They're all experiences that have to do with the capacity to perceive afresh deep personal meaning within oneself and life, more broadly speaking. And when you look at this concept of experiences really as the foundation for these sustained changes, when you look at the possible neurobiology that underlies it, I soon realized that actually there's nothing mysterious at play here. Like our brains literally evolved to do exactly that. Our brains are constantly adapting itself to experiences, and in particularly experiences that are personally significant for our survival, significant for our thriving as an individual. And that goes in both ends. It goes to experiences that are potentially life-threatening as well as experiences that are life-giving. But experiences that have a big impact on our being are always the experiences that shape us, and that happens without psychedelics as well. And this is well documented. Deep experiences with nature, meaningful connections, romantic love, even experience with art, they all can be life-changing in the real meaning of the word. And this is really what I think is one of the most interesting elements of psychedelic therapy, is that in essence, what therapists are tasked with, are invited to learn, are invited to become really good at, is the question, how can I facilitate an experience for this patient, rather than asking what kind of drugs should I prescribe to this patient based on this set of diagnoses. It actually goes back to a lot of important psychotherapeutic foundations. For example, Carl Rogers talks about, the founder of the client-centered, person-centered psychotherapy movement, talks about the importance of what he calls a growth-promoting environment. It's through what environment an individual needs in order to drop the defenses, drop the psychological defenses as such that he or she can relate authentically with oneself, which is really hard, especially in this modern world with so many distractions and judgments and fears and anxieties. Is this question, how can we create an environment where someone can be really authentic with oneself, whatever that is? And that's again linking this with the topic earlier in this conversation. The big difference with the medical model is psychiatrists are not trained to think through what experiences to give to a patient. But in psychedelic therapy, it's absolutely essential to do that. Because if you don't do that, people will be channeled into this potentially really bad experience that can be traumatic and counter-therapeutic and all of that. So when we take that as a foundation for psychedelic therapy, what Wavepaths is doing is acknowledging that that may be a foundation for the future of mental health care itself. when we project into the future and ask how mental health care can be and maybe should be revolutionized, in my opinion, it will become more and more experiential. Therapists and facilitators of all sorts will be more and more acknowledging and understanding the importance of experience. And then the question is, how can we help this new generation of therapists? How can we help this new generation of facilitators and equip them with the right tools to do that? In the same way that surgeons, when they perform a physical surgery, have a whole toolkit available to do the right procedures at the right time, the future will need to have what I started to call a few years ago a toolkit of psychedelic technologies, psychedelic tools, psychedelic instruments that are not designed to open up the body, but to open up the mind in all sorts of ways. And music is, for various reasons that we can go into, I believe one of the most powerful ways to do that. Even without drugs, music itself really can be a psychedelic in the real meaning of the word psychedelic. And this is really the vision of Wavepaths, is that experiences can be medicine, and that we can, with the right music in the right moment, and with the right framing of the music. It's not only about the music itself, it's also about the way the music is approached, the way one listens to music. That music can become this mind revealing, soul revealing agent, this agent for change.
A lot of gold there. Thank you. those three conditions that Carl Rogers talked about: genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. I think that's huge. And I can think of a lot of, places where those are big, right? Like, just think Burning Man. Like, how genuine are people at Burning Man often, And, if your therapist doesn't feel genuine or accepting or empathetic, then that's a big problem. But what if we could create those and cultivate those? I think that's a big deal.
Yeah. And exactly. It's just like initiatives like Burning Man and so many others in the same vein
Right.
are really there as a response to this illness in society, in which it's very hard to be authentic. So there's these parallel societies almost that are being created as a response to this need for people to become more of oneself, or more fuller oneself. Maybe not necessarily more of oneself, but a more fuller version of oneself. And it's great that you're familiar with Roger's work. I really came to see that his philosophies became um, became sketched and interpreted in a too simplistic way. People often characterize him as this person that would recommend that you, as a therapist, the main thing you need to do is reflect back to the person, to the patient, to the client, what he or she just said. And in that way, by mirroring the process, by following the process, you are providing this right environment for insight and change. But the reality of the situation is that he had these really interesting, deep ideas. He believed that if we succeed in in designing this growth promoting environment on empathy and genuineness and what's the other one? Remind me, the third one.
Empathy.
Empathy.
So it was like genuineness, acceptance, and empathy.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So these pillars as the foundation for this growth promoting environment, then you would tap into a creative tendency, a creative force within oneself that, in his words, and paraphrasing him, is part of the same creative force of the universe. And he talks about, in one of his essays, about syntropy, not entropy. This idea of entropy in the universe is that everything is always moving towards chaos and disorder. But within life, there is this principle of syntropy, of maintaining order and striving towards fulfillment, and which really closely links with this idea in biology of homeostasis and protection against that disorder. But it's an idea that is, needless to say, as well, quite resonant with a lot of the philosophies that psychedelic therapists are borrowing from holotropic breathwork. This idea of that there is an inner healer intelligence within oneself, which I like to unpack and describe more as that there is something in our subconscious mind that is actually very intelligent, maybe even more intelligent, way more intelligent than our conscious mind. And what seemed to be happening in psychedelic experiences is that the usual ruling influence of this rational, conscious, in Freudian terms, one may say, the ego mind is temporarily dissolved in order for that other intelligence to be more influential.
Yeah. And you make a good point there, just backing up to the beginning of the Carl Rogers thing. Like we do this so often. Like say Carl Rogers is really easy to understand. It's just reflecting back. Like that's exactly how everybody talks about Carl Rogers, who's not super interested in Carl Rogers' work, generally
Mm.
speaking. And we do that with everybody. Like, it's just kind of our heuristic, right? A shortcut to like save mental calories or something. But
True. Yeah.
it cheapens a lot of, what the value we could get from Carl Rogers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay. So Wavepaths, I remember a while back, there was a facility that was opened up in London. Was it like a temporary installation?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what was that like? Was it kind of like sci-fi chairs and speakers and all that kind of stuff, or what was going on in there?
The opposite of that. Yeah. The idea there was to launch our first prototype into the public, while at the same time gathering research data on the success of that. What's really central to our work is the development of a generative music system, and more broadly speaking, an adaptive generative environment. So an environment that is responsive to the individual's state, the individual's way of being in that moment, and can match those needs in that moment more accurately. So in our generative music system, we basically created an algorithmically flexible musical environment where we commission musicians to not compose tracks. So we don't work with compositions and tracks. We work with the building blocks of music. We have, let's say, one musician delivering to us a few hundred different melody phrases, another one a few hundred different chords, and so forth and so on. We have about 250 different contributions at this moment
Mm.
in a library, and they're tagged based on their acoustic properties and their compositional qualities, their instrumentations. But then we basically have this very advanced algorithmic DJ system with different channels that, based on the current situation, is blending these different building blocks together in real time for the individual. And the reason why we do that is to help therapists and facilitators to be able to more dynamically, more smoothly, more easily adapt the music on the fly for the very dynamically unfolding patient experience. So, with that context in mind, what we did in the pop up space in London that you mentioned, we had a very first version of this system, and we asked ourselves, can we facilitate psychedelic experiences without the psychedelic drug? Can we do that by a combination of music and sensory design and ritual? And the way we did that was, that's where Brian Eno came in as well. He primarily worked on the light experience of that space. We had two different rooms in one venue. The individual, the visitor, would meet a trained psychotherapist, a guide, in this light art space, and would be guided to and helped to slow down, connect more deeply with oneself, and set an intention for the experience. And then after that, the visitor would go into this music space. And in the music space, we had kind of the opposite. It was a fully darkened space, fully padded, and we had 21 speakers for one person. And our generative music system blended music based on the breathing of the individual, the breathing depth and the breathing frequency of the individual, and would on top of that spatialize the sound in 3D to create this really deeply immersive experience for the visitor. And we combined that with research. So we asked people afterwards to complete questionnaires that assess their well-being and the acute experience as well. And we used validated metrics for that, the same metrics as used in psychedelic therapy research. And we showed exactly the same phenomena. We showed that the degree to which people experienced peak experiences or and personally meaningful experiences, that correlated linearly very strongly with the degree to which we measured improvements in well-being the day after.
Mm.
So it was really an experiment on many different fronts. It was a success as well on a business front. It sold out in less than 2 weeks. We had thousands of people on the wait list. And then we used those insights to develop the technology further. And where we are now is we, in the wake of COVID-19, we focused purely on software development. And we have created this platform for therapists that therapists are already using in their practice for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy primarily, but also drug-free psychotherapies. We have some psychotherapists, we have some yoga teachers, we have some breathwork facilitators. Everyone that is interested, basically, to give a bit more thought into how to design the right sonic and musical environments for your clients is currently beta testing this platform. And we're releasing it as a little plug into the public in January next year. By the end of January next year, we have a public version available as well.
That's outstanding. And so it's not necessarily all AI, right? Like the facilitator, the therapist is actually helping input to what they're observing.
Exactly. Yeah, the AI component right now is purely limited to the way the music happens and is created. We are on top of that working on ways that AI and machine learning models can help with building predictions about what music is most likely to be suitable for this person in this moment, given the person's profile. But the manual changes during the session are initiated by the therapist manually. Yeah. And the way we are designing the interface is really as a musical instrument. We really want this not to feel like a piece of software that you have on your laptop in your session, but more like a musical instrument that you interact with intuitively to change the musical variables as you wish during the session itself.
Mm. It's really interesting. And what kind of feedback do you have these the therapists look for? Is it facial expressions, breathing rates?
Yeah, one of the important things to emphasize here is that I mentioned this before as well. It's not only about the music, it's also really about understanding the ways that you can work with music and the ways that you as a therapist can get a bit of deeper understanding of the experience the patient has and how you can use that information to adapt the music based on the patient. There's many different reasons, for example, why a piece of music may evoke a degree of resistance or rejection for the patient. And one of the most important things for the therapist is to figure out what the source of that resistance is. Because each of these different forms of resistance will need a different way of working with music. But usually, if you ask the more advanced psychedelic therapists, they would say that they use a lot of intuition. They work with a lot of intuition. They are really working to attune themselves as deeply as possible to the process of the patient. And I really think that's important to acknowledge and not to be brushed aside. But at the same time, I do believe there are certain variables that are important to notice as well. The tone of the voice, the frequency and the depth of the breathing, the body postures, the content of the experience when you may have a short conversation and exchange with your patient. They all inform this music matching process.
Mm. Well, that's really cool. I'd love to see it in practice at some point. The future. I'm sure you're keenly acutely aware here is like wearables and how that might feed in and help inform the therapist even more. Like,
Sure.
oh, they're 30% higher respiratory rate than before, and same with the pulse.
Yeah,
what's going on. And
we're doing that. Well, yeah, we have actually we hired a really good neuroscientist that has a lot of experience and expertise, not only in neuroscience but in biometrics as well. That is currently actively looking into this question of what biometric variables are most useful to inform this process. There are some initiatives out there, non-psychedelic related, that may look into kind of heart rate, brainwave, breathing entrainment, and some of that may be useful to if you want to work on variables like providing calm and reassurance. But I think the magic of music, so to speak, the real opportunity of music really lies in the psychology of music. So there is a danger if you build these generative music systems that are all based on matching the heart rates and breathing rhythms with patterns and rhythms, and that it very quickly becomes this cold, mechanical, generative music system, which people always often, let me say that, often think about when they when they hear the term generative music. And this is one thing that we can pride ourselves for, is that the most of our effort really went deeply into making sure that the music system sounds really good and human and warm and smooth, which not a single other generative music system out there, in my humble opinion, has. They all have this either cold mechanical feel to it or this kind of spa music like feel to it, which is also not very applicable and useful for psychedelic therapy. The most profound experiences with psychedelic therapy with music seem to happen in these very engaging musical experiences where the subtlety in the way music happens, the tone color, the dynamics that happen on the level of the harmonics itself is very important. And at this moment, at least, you can't fake that with a generative system. So this is why we work with these human-made components. So it's not that the music is computer generated. All the music that we work with is created by human beings, by artists that are deeply engaged with our vision and are deeply either knowledgeable or educated on the importance of understanding that this music will be played for people in this really receptive, vulnerable state of being. But where the AI comes in and where the technology comes in is how the composition is created in real time and how that is smoothly adapted to match the individual's process. So it's important to emphasize that this is not called computer generated music, but they're all human beings that we're working with.
Yeah, this is music is very complicated, and people don't, music is just something people have on in the background and don't necessarily observe as something special often anymore. It's like, oh, I only like Bruce Springsteen. It's like, what? There's
Yeah,
so much music out there, and there's so many ways to make it. Like, technology has expanded the toolkit like crazy of the
yeah,
musician,
yeah,
and it's not to be discounted. Like, this idea of critiquing electronic music or like suggesting it's cold AI generated music is kind of silly in a lot of ways, because
yeah,
like so many film scores, so many meaningful things were composed on digital systems and using like really high
yeah.
quality samples. And like, what's the difference between like Hans Zimmer and like like a project that 30 people worked on?
Oh yeah, yeah. You're totally right, and I definitely don't want to say that there is no place for electronic music. It's the opposite, actually. There's a very important, unique place for electronic music in this context. But it really depends on what what I refer to as what your musical personality is. What
Mm,
is what are the collections of tone colors and harmonies and instruments and melodies that you seem to have built a relationship with over all those decades in life? And sometimes I even would dare to speculate that it's going beyond the music that we have been exposed to in our upbringing and in our lives, and it actually goes back maybe even into things like the voices of significant people in our lives, our
mm,
caregivers, our teachers. But yeah, electronic music has, this is often what I emphasize as well. Electronic music or modern compositional methods create a world of opportunities for musical experiences in psychedelic therapy that not a single live musician can do with a single instrument or even a group of instruments.
mhm.
And then on top of that, we can talk about the way the music is delivered. Right? We work with these 3D sound technologies, for example, where you can literally spatialize sound. You can literally move different stems and samples of the music around in space and create a sense of space opening up or widening or moving up or moving down or going inward, and all sorts of different things. So the opportunities with technology are vast, and we are simply looking at technology always through the lens of how can this be used for therapy? How can this be used to facilitate these experiences that are life changing for people? Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming too technocentric. And so, when you mentioned how our pop-up space in London looked like, and you mentioned these sci-fi designs, it's actually the opposite. One of our design principles has always been that although it's a technology-centric environment, that technology has a central role. I don't want a single piece of technology to be visible for the visitor. I want all to be about the texture, the immediacy of the texture and the sensory experience of the textures in sound, the textures in light, the textures in smell, and the temporal components of that, and really move away from environments where there's so many cables and sockets and buzzing machines in the background, and really create an environment that is really designed in an insane amount of detail around the experience of the individual. But yeah, it has been an interesting journey, this space, because that the importance of these physical spaces is that we have full control over those things. And once we're offering this music to people through an app, for example, that we are releasing next year, we don't have control over the sound quality. We don't have control over the environment in which people listen to it. We don't have control over the ritual and the attention that people give to the music. And in a space, we have that. And on top of that, I really believe there is a really important role in addressing the mental health care crisis for physical environments, for real physical spaces where people come together in a community and share the experience with other people, and not go through this experience alone, but really have a shared experience with other people that are in there maybe for the same reasons or related reasons. And then there's the sound systems. Like in these environments, we had a sound system that was worth 250,000 in that one pop-up for one single individual, and that is only very, very fortunate individuals may be able to afford that for themselves. And there will be, I think, a role for creating these environments specifically for the purpose of mental health and beauty. And thankfully, we're still working on that. It's not our main goal to set up our own space in the next year, but we're working with many different retreat centers and other venues that are interested in utilizing our insights when it comes to experience design and music design and sound design.
Well, that's beautiful. Yeah, I really admire that. Like the technology is just too pervasive.
Yeah.
Making it transparent and comfortable is, in the interest of design, I think, and like human comfort.
Totally, yeah. And you brought up this really important point about music that became, for so many people, for too many people, this background noise rather than something that you actively relate with. And when I talk about the importance of the attitude towards the music, the way of listening to music, this is exactly what we are working on and focusing on is acknowledging that music has this immense potential. But that potential, like the potential in psychedelics, I dare to say, is easily lost if those other variables are not taken seriously. And when it comes to music, it's really, really comparable to psychedelic therapy. It really has to do with the same elements, like the capacity to be open to music, to be fully open, to be fully moved by the music itself. And on top of that, to be attentive, to be curious, to be engaged with the unfolding of the experience, the imagery, the thoughts, the feelings, the physical sensations, all of that, and how that is in constant flux and change with the musical experience. And if you attend to that and are capable to surrender to that, you are carried on a journey. You're literally carried on the psychedelic journey inside of yourself in the same way as in the psychedelic therapy context. And this is not something new. Right? This is what shamans have been doing for a long period of time, where shamanism is simply a collection of methods to enter an altered state of consciousness. And in areas where there are no plants available, you often still see the prevalence, the pervasive presence of music in all sorts of forms. And this is the interesting thing when you study the development of shamanism and how that led to organized religions of various forms. Still, you have music present in all these, many, if not most, of these religions around the world. And this is, I believe, simply a remnant of these very early shamanic practices. But that capacity of music to bring this really profound shift in consciousness is indeed, like you say, not how most people would think about music or relate to music. But there are, I believe, some spontaneous expressions of this in our society. You have rave cultures, for example, that are tapping into these instincts, these instinctive desires to alter ourselves, also with repetitive rhythms to facilitate these trance states. Not all, but many of these club cultures are not necessarily centered around deeply immersive therapeutic experiences, but some are, and some of these environments definitely provide very interesting opportunities for people to perceive oneself in a different way and connect with people in a new way, and can be very therapeutic and very life changing in their own respects.
Mm, right. Like I'm hoping for some sort of resurgence around respect for music. So nobody really like it's not really part of many of our cultures to get really into it and
Mm.
really like dissect either live performance or like different things they did in production that cause certain effects. Like, did you like that? What did you like about that auto tune, for instance, or like what did you hate about it? Like, I feel like there should be a lot more conversation around this stuff, and I'm hoping like with wave paths and psychedelics becoming more popular, more people being more aware of it, that perhaps there would be a deeper connection to music for more people and therefore have like a more intelligent music culture. Hopefully,
Right.
that's one hope, but
Yeah,
maybe it's just artistic culture in general.
sure. Yeah, sure. And I do think it may be an expression of a certain shallowness that has emerged in mainstream culture over the last decades, if you wish, or maybe even longer. And the music being an expression of that. At the same time, I don't think we should be too easily judgmental about modern mainstream music culture because still, even with some of the modern, very popular pop artists, it's very clear that these pop artists are reflective and representing certain archetypal and embody certain archetypal elements for a lot of people around the world and are able to respond to problems in the world in their own ways and are in that way providing meaning and ways for people to give meaning to themselves in the world. But I think it's less about, let me put it this way, I think it's more about the depth of engagement with music, which is what I think will be the trigger for that shift that we're talking about. And the very fact that people all around the world, most people, have already some connection with music is a really positive thing. And this is a really interesting phenomena that, for example, caregivers, mothers usually, studied in many different cultures. Every single culture that this has been studied, caregivers instinctively sing songs, sing lullabies for babies. Why is this? Well, one of the main theories is that babies are hardwired at birth to respond to melodies and tone colors and are, in essence, musical creatures before they are verbal, linguistic creatures. They have innate tendencies to respond to musical features in various forms. So we are, in a way, already innately equipped in a primitive way, but that definitely innately equipped with musicality. And then how that relation with music is shaped is really up to educations, educational organizations, parents, and societies themselves. But the very fact that there is already that relationship in place, I think, is a very positive thing. And I sometimes compare this with wine. I remember drinking my, uh, as a biology student, the first few years, drinking the cheapest wine that we could find in the supermarket. And then years later, being introduced to locally harvested and created wine in Portugal. And I was blown away by the richness in the taste and um, all the different shapes of that taste that I could identify, and how that taste experience would evolve over time. Like it would evolve over the seconds that you would sip the wine from that glass. And I think it's very similar with music. I think people have been drinking bad wine for a long time, and I think it's time to help people to listen more deeply to the sound of the music and the contours in the music and what the music is doing, and thereby also opening up other avenues into music and different forms of music, different styles of music as a consequence of that. But I think it first needs to happen with that shift in attention. Funny enough, with psychedelic therapy, a lot of patients do this themselves. They there is this one patient, I think I've shared this before in public, this anecdote, but one patient that was asked in a post therapy interview what the side effects, possible side effects, were of the therapy, and he thought and responded after a silence, saying, the only side effect that I can think of is that I started to spend way too much money on a good sound system. Because he discovered this whole new world of music in the psychedelic therapy session. And this is very common. You hear this a lot in therapy. And this is already shown in the 60s. There's many different studies published that demonstrated that people after their psychedelic therapy experience in general seem to have a deeper engagement with aesthetics in art, aesthetics in nature. And there's some modern work done as well on connectivity in general, work by Ross Watts, for example, and others that show that there is this enhanced connectivity that happens with oneself and the world around oneself and other people, but also things like nature and art, which I think are really, really interesting observations that can be exploited, it can be utilized, it can be worked with as well in order to help people to sustain that new relationship with oneself. And this is really where I see one of the many different ways music can be helpful in this future of mental health care that we are together creating and manifesting is music as a therapist, music as a healer, music as maybe that third parent that you didn't have access to while you were growing up, music as that source for acknowledgement and love. Right? We talked about Carl Rogers, and he talks about unconditional positive regard. And when I thought about it at some point, I realized he was just talking about love. But his idea back then of the importance of listening to patients was already so radically different and controversial that I think he did a good deal in talking about unconditional positive regard. But in essence, I think he was talking about love. And this is a very interesting scenario. How can we, and question, how can we create a system, a mental health care system and a society that is built on those values, where we can create and design environments where people don't feel judged all the time, not are judged all the time, and can feel loved and can feel acknowledged and respected for whoever they are. And I think music is one really powerful way to help with that. But it always should be seen in a larger context. It should be seen in the interpersonal context and all sorts of other things as well.
Mm. Huh. There's so much here to talk about. I can understand why you've dedicated your life to this.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. Music itself, I would say, is as interesting as psychedelics. They're
Absolutely.
more interesting for me as music. They're both super fascinating and have their own unique roles to play in the future of mental health care.
Mm. Hmm. Absolutely. Cool. So we're going to see a publicly available version of Wavepaths near end of January 2021.
Yeah, Yeah.
Great.
One is a more safer.
Consumer grade or like for therapists only?
So what we're doing is we are making a lightweighted version of our therapy app available for both consumers and therapists. And then we are continuously beta testing this more extensive version for therapists that have all sorts of advanced controls for the music, advanced ways to personalize the music before and after the session. We're building a preparation and integration feature where music is used to the music that you've listened to during the session can be used for the integration period afterwards,
Mm,
for example. Those things will be part of that more advanced version for therapists and clinics. But this lightweighted version will be released in a web app in Q1 and will be priced as such as well. But it is available and accessible for basically everyone. But then the more serious practitioners, they want to eventually use this more advanced platform for their practice.
mm.
It's a way to acknowledge this interest from both angles that we clearly have witnessed over the last years.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big deal how many people are doing this on their own without great tools yet.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really great tool
Mm.
that'll help a lot of people. So I'm really impressed, Mendel. I'm really appreciative of you coming on the show to talk to us about all this. I the, this is such a deep topic that I feel like people should be discussing this a lot more. And I hope this interview helps a little bit to get people more interested in the why.
Thank you.
Yeah. Like it's not as easy as just throwing acid in somebody's mouth, right? You got to understand music to a different degree.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I guess
yeah.
in some rare circumstances that may work, but it shouldn't be the first route.
Right. Cool. Well, anything else you want to throw out? Like, it's just wavepaths.com.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for bringing me on, and
Yeah.
I feel actually we're just warming up and starting to explore possible avenues to go deeper. But it's super nice to at least explore some of these main concepts together. Yeah, I guess if people are interested to learn more, they can go to our website. They can sign up to our newsletter. We have different wait lists available for these different tools that we're developing. I think that's the best way to follow us. We also have Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all those things.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Mendel Kaelen, really appreciate you coming on. And yeah, hope we get to do it again.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe.
And there you have it, Mendel Kaelen, Wavepaths. I hope you liked that one. Let us know what you think. Hit us up over at Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com, or use a contact form on our site at psychedelicstoday.com. We would, really like to hear what you think about music and psychedelics. There's a lot to this topic and a lot more to dig into. I hope this is just the start of Psychedelics Today's digging in to this whole topic. We've been talking about it peripherally for a while, but not so directly. And I think the time has come. So thank you, Mendel, for coming on. Everybody should check out Wavepaths, at least get informed on what it is. And we hope to have Mendel on again in the future. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode. This is Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. Bye-bye.